Good morning, British and American culture class. This is part 2 of our very last content class. So we have a lot of things to talk about as usual. As I've said to you all along, some of the things I choose have to be somewhat selective and biased because otherwise we'll be doing a 1-hour lecture like we were doing earlier this semester, which was not very popular. And it was a little bit tough for me to do too. So we're going to try to condense and focus on a few things that are, as usual, representative of contemporary British and American culture, okay? Just a quick announcement. There's a bunch of information that I uploaded over the weekend. Information about the exam, where you're writing, a grade report for the assignments you submitted. There's the study guide. Please read all of that and make sure you know what's going on. We have the exam in a couple weeks. This week I will do 2 more video lectures, but they will not have any new content. It'll be just the first part will be the first 7 weeks, and the second part will be the remaining part of the term, going over everything. And of course, I'm doing this lecture today, so I won't be doing a whole lot of review about the chapters at the end of the book because it's fresh. But certainly we need to go back to the beginning and go over all the stuff that I talked about earlier this term. So those are the video lectures this week. And that's it. Then there's no more video lectures. You just have to prepare for the exam. So, first part of the lecture, we talked about the American system. In particular, we talked about that because there are so many republics around the world that are modeled after the American system. And I didn't talk about, the influences of the Roman Republic or, the French Enlightenment a whole lot. But basically, in its current form, the American system has been copied or used or altered in its various forms, including in South Korea. So it's good to know sort of what the principles and the main ideas of how those branches of government work. Now, the British have a different system. It's not a republic. It was briefly a commonwealth under Cromwell, as you may remember, in the 17th century, but that was an experiment that failed. So they returned to the monarchy thing, but as our book says, this is about the evolution and revolution of culture. So really, you might say, essentially, the British culture is more conservative than the American one. That's one of the reasons why America began to attract a whole lot of people from all over the world, but especially the people that didn't fit in, the people that were not conservative enough, the Puritans and other dissenters and radicals, and the people who wanted to have lifestyles that didn't match the English model, especially. They left Britain and they tried to find a life somewhere else. It didn't work out in the Netherlands, so they ended up in North America. So you can see there's some really sad, terrible, horrible things happening in the United States. They've got a 2 crisis situation going on now because there's been a man named George Floyd, who was a black man who was arrested and killed by a police officer, which sparked off a whole bunch of protests and riots across the United States. And now there's police and protesters and violence and rioting going on in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic. Those 2 things happening at the same time are a recipe for disaster. One of them alone is a disaster enough. But I've been telling you, we're talking about contemporary culture right now. This is the environment, a more revolutionary, volatile culture that doesn't have more of a conservative base. Sometimes we think Americans are conservative, but really, there's different types of conservatives and they all have different ideas, which if you're a libertarian, I don't know if you consider that conservative. But regardless, in England and in British culture in general, there is this attachment to tradition, which is one of the reasons why I go through all of these things. And like the rich culture of the British and it has an influence on everything they do, on their education. They may be resistant to it. They may try and overthrow it. You might hear some British people say, well, I don't want to pay taxes to the Queen. Why do we even have a royal family anyway? But there's a good reason that they do, and that most countries don't still have a royal family. The reason is because they wouldn't let it go. Most British people still support the royal family. They're a living, breathing representation of the continuity of British culture, and a lot of British people like that. They may say bad things or curse them or whatever, but certain events like Princess Diana, who was married into the royal family, when she died, that was one of the biggest funerals in British history. That she was a celebrity. She was beloved by the people, and she was a royal. She was a member of the royal family, right? She was divorced, but and King William and Kate, they also are representative of this royal family. I'm just using this as an example of the attachment to tradition and the sort of the element of British culture, which I personally I like it, where they have one foot in the past always and one toe dipping into the future, and they have a lot of. They hesitate and they don't overthrow and they don't, they're not really a revolutionary people. I don't want to stereotype, but, Italy has gone through revolution after revolution. Is it that because of the people, or is it because of their environment, or because of their history? I'm not saying it's genetic or anything else, but Italy is a revolutionary state. And America is a revolutionary state. They go through revolutions constantly, and they sometimes throw themselves into a new form of something, a new technology, a new political environment. We discussed a lot about how America was isolationist in the 20th century, in the 19th century rather, and kind of slowly, but suddenly and then pulling back, they became the opposite. They became a hyper-interventionalist state. And that's a revolutionary change. When your country goes from insularity, where they're only paying attention to their own business, to interfering with every country's affairs in the entire world, that's a dramatic change. And I would argue that's a revolution. Now, the royal family itself, we've talked about them enough. We went all the way back to real kings and mythical kings, King Arthur and King Alfred. But you have to remember that contemporary culture still hangs on to that symbolic nature of the royal family. She doesn't. Queen of England doesn't doesn't really have legal or political or administrative function. She is an ambassador. She is representative. She reflects aspects of British culture, which advertises, or you might even say she's a kind of public celebrity who advertises, promotes Britishness in various forms around the world. She's a very well-respected woman. William and Kate, Prince William and Kate, he's the oldest son of Princess Diana and Prince Charles, Prince of Wales. And he's got children, and he, travels to Australia and Canada and New Zealand with his family. And all the Canadians come out to see the royal family, the next generation who's going to be on their money next. Why do they do that? The roots go deep. My sister's middle name is Elizabeth. My daughter's middle name is Elizabeth. I mean, you can just find examples from the top to the bottom of British culture that are still infused with the elements of the monarchy, and largely they are not related to actual power, but they have something called soft power, which means they influence. It's the Queen Victoria effect, where Queen Victoria says, well, I might like it if we did this, and then 1,000 people decide to do what she says. She doesn't even have to order it. She just has to suggest it, and then it can get done because of her influence. So the royal family is still there. There's a lot of people in in England think that's outdated, it doesn't belong in the 21st century. Everybody else got rid of their royal family, so why do we have one? But like I said, there's a good reason. It's this progression into the next level, to the next phase of culture, but hanging on to the things that they think are essential to, to what they are, to their identity. So what is the real Great Britain? The royal family is part of that. You can't remove that. You can now, but you can't remove 1,000 years and more of it from British life. So they're included. Now, what happens, I think, for a lot of people is this Anglo-Saxon, well, she's German. She's German and Anglo-Saxon. She's basically a foreigner genetically, let's be honest. The royal family is intermarried with all kinds of Europeans. So Queen Elizabeth is probably less English than most English people are. But nonetheless, we have this kind of, especially when she was young, very pretty, proper, well-mannered, educated, representative lady, wealthy lady, representing England. And then you have, especially in the last 100 years, because of the nature of empire, you have this influx of people from the colonies or the dominions, whether it's Canada or Australia or whatever the status is. It's the part of the empire, the protectorate. They have all these territories all over the world. India is one of the largest and most important one. People start moving back, and for various reasons. Some of them are servants, some of them are doctors, some of them are lawyers, some of them are soldiers. And, just like the Roman Empire, it becomes this thing, well, you did service, you speak the language, and now you live in Britain. So you're a British citizen, right? According to the way that the culture has evolved and how the Constitution is built, that it's not based on your ethnicity or your race or where you were born, but that you can be a participant in the society, a member of the nation, as long as you participate as a citizen should, right? If you're not a criminal and you're not invading, if you're participating and you have a value to add it, or especially if you've done some service, like military service, for the British Empire, you deserve to have the status of a citizen. So, although any country resists, a large influx of certain types of people because they've become concerned that they're going to be swallowed up and taken. Their lifestyle is going to change, and they're going to lose their job, and the culture is going to take theirs over, and everything they know, their life is going to be turned upside down, and suddenly they won't be able to recognize their own country. That's sort of something that's natural for human beings to do, and Koreans get that kind of xenophobia sometimes, even though there's really not that many foreigners compared to Koreans here, but you all know what I mean. As there was this, when there was the collapse after World War II, the British Empire started to break apart and established this loose connection of states called the Commonwealth, the British Commonwealth, which still exists, but it's really just kind of a network of countries that have a common background in the way they formed through, British administration, and now they're all distinct and they have little in common other than that in some cases, but in the case of Canada, more. But anyway, places like Jamaica and Pakistan and India, Australia and Canada, there were many people, for various reasons, that they chose to immigrate to the United Kingdom. And most of them chose for various reasons, but mostly because of jobs and the concentration of population, to move to England rather than Wales or Scotland or Northern Ireland. So there becomes this concentration of new people from various parts of the empire moving there, and this starts to change the demographics of the United Kingdom. it becomes more diverse. Not to say that the English weren't diverse before. There was lots of Europeans, for the most part, that were in London and in southern England before. For ages and ages, there was French and Belgians and Dutch people and Spanish people and Scottish people all mixing in southern England. But now you got people from all over the world moving and sometimes, staying and making a life for themselves. Then the United Kingdom decided that they were going to join the EU. And in the EU, one of the principles of the EU is free movement of population. So when they joined the EU and they agreed to follow the rules, it's very complicated, so don't ask me to tell you all the rules that you have to follow. But one of them is that you're not supposed to restrict movement of populations across borders. So when that happened, later at the end of the 20th century, when England decided finally to join the Eurozone and to participate as a member of the European Union, this meant that the populations of Eastern Europe, who were looking for better opportunities because the economies in their country or their livelihood, or they're looking for better education, they could do all sorts of things. They could be studying, or they could be working, or they could be traveling. But there were waves and waves of people, especially from Poland, but from the eastern countries of Europe. And so there's these huge populations of Eastern Europeans arriving too. And so you have this very cosmopolitan city, which is really cool, I think. And in London, it works very well. But in some of the other cities, it didn't work as well. They felt like neighborhoods were being taken over essentially by foreigners, and that the local people, they weren't being absorbed into British culture, and British culture was being overturned. And there was a number of reasons for the Brexit vote, which they narrowly voted to leave the EU a couple years ago. But there's a number of reasons why they voted against, for leaving, but against staying, so that they're going to be separated now and they're not in the EU. But immigration was one of those things. It was one of the major issues that the people who wanted the yes vote to leave, they were encouraging people to vote to leave, were saying that we need to protect our country and that uncontrolled immigration is not good for our society. Now, I've been to London once, and I was surprised, to be honest, when I got on the subway, and the variety of people was like New York City or Toronto. Seoul is not like that. Like if you go to Itaewon, you're gonna kind of get that kind of flavor. But this is just any subway station in New York or any subway station in Toronto or London. There's a complete there's a mosaic of people. It's just all different shapes and sizes and colors and styles of clothing and dress and languages and everything. It's amazing. For some reason, that's not what I expected. It's because, I was expecting a bunch of, stiff-collared, cane-twirling, top hat-wearing British people. I don't know what I was thinking, but I always wanted to go to London because my ancestors worked on the docks there. So I wanted to check it out, and it's very, very... It's very cosmopolitan. The immigration has enriched London, I think, in a way that is very, very positive. That's my personal opinion. So I was very disappointed when the Brexit vote went the other way, because I feel like London is that combination of the foot in the tradition with the, Buckingham Palace and Trafalgar Square and Westminster and everything. It's got all of the old buildings and the castles and the churches, St. Paul's, and it's got the royal family, and it's got its foot in the the toe in the water there with all the contributions of culture from around the world, from the individuals who have different backgrounds from other countries and different life. So we'll see what happens. It doesn't necessarily mean that just because they left the EU that London's not still going to be this international global city. I think it will be. It just goes to show that the when you looked at the results of the vote, a lot of the people in the countryside were voted to leave, and that London voted to stay, and that's clearly because people in London have embraced this global, this idea that Britishness is global and not located in some sort of geographical, ethnic, uh, you know, English Britain sense. So this island mentality still exists, you might say, that they're still trying to protect their island from having too many people invade. And you can understand that, I suppose, if you look back to the first lesson that we had, is they were constantly trying to protect themselves from invaders from other countries. So this is essentially what the immigration question involves. If you look at all the talented people these days in British life, celebrities, a lot of them, their ancestors are from South Asia or from Africa. All the the great athletes they have, the sprinters in the Olympics, and the comedians now, and the actors and stuff. Idris, the super handsome dude, he's British too, and traditionally he wouldn't be considered British. He's one of the most British people I can think of. It has nothing to do with the color of his skin. He's quintessentially British because of his behavior, his manner, and his attitude. So that's what I want you to recognize, that immigration is part of the British identity. That it's really becoming, if you want, this is where the difference is. If you call yourself English, the person is less likely to call themselves English than they are to call themselves British, because British has this global element to it. So remember that. Immigration is important to the idea of what the real Great Britain actually is. And remember that, 1 foot in the past, 1 foot in the present kind of idea. So you got the royal family, you've got immigration. I skipped over declinism because that's also, you might call it like an empire, an imperial hangover. What happened was the British Empire, as you know, American power increased. The British Empire won World War I and World War II, but it was so expensive and it was so draining politically and socially that by the time they were done fighting both those wars, it didn't matter that they had won, because they had nothing left to keep their empire going. It was a really strange situation to begin with, honestly. The amount of resources and the number of soldiers and ships that the British Empire used to maintain his empire was tiny. In ways, it didn't really make sense. If all of the countries decided to make trouble at the same time, the British Empire would have fallen apart instantly. So there was this perception since Napoleon was defeated that the British Empire was so powerful and that you couldn't even challenge it. But after World War I and World War II, many politicians, countries, peoples, cultures realized that that was not true. The British didn't have as much of an advantage as they thought. And they didn't, this high level of prestige of the British dropped, right? Especially when Japan started their effort in World War II, and the British couldn't handle them at all. The Americans had to do it. The American prestige increased, and the British prestige lowered to the point where there was trouble in a lot of territories, and for good reason, because they wanted to, even if they left, even if it was worse, if they left the British Empire, they still just wanted to make their own choices. It's just like when, I like to think about it like when you're your age, when you're in university, it's obviously easier to live at home with your parents and to get free food and to have a room and your mother to do your laundry and stuff. It's going to be worse to move out and have a one-room apartment that's dirty and you have to clean it, and all the great food your mother makes, and when you get sick she takes care of you, all this kind of stuff. But you leave anyway because you want to do it yourself. You want to be independent. So nations are like that too. It doesn't matter if sometimes it doesn't matter if the situation is better than it would be. because this is what happens to a lot of countries when they left the British Empire. Things fell apart and they had revolutions and they had terrible dictators and they had civil wars and stuff like that. That's what happened, but that's what generally the people wanted. They just wanted to make their own decisions. They wanted control over themselves. And that's part of the reason for Brexit too, is just the United Kingdom wants to have control over itself, whether it's for good or for better or for worse. So they knew this. They knew that countries were going to leave and that there really wasn't a whole lot they could do about it militarily, and politically it didn't make sense, and financially they couldn't handle it. So essentially there was a process of just trying to let the countries slowly take over and manage themselves until all the territories were gone. And this process took a while. It took several decades for them to sort of withdraw piece by piece, and in some cases it worked better than others. In some cases it did not work at all. But this soft landing idea is like the British withdrawing themselves from the territories of their empire. Okay, last thing. Winston Churchill's in the textbook. Don't worry about chapter 8, okay? Because chapter 8, as I told you, I've never actually made it to chapter 8, and it's just because it's about the general militarization of society. It has a lot to do with an American influence, and there's talk about atomic bombs and about drugs and about protests and stuff. It's very relevant stuff, but it's a very short chapter, and I'm not going to include it on the exam. So the very last thing I'm going to talk about is Winston Churchill. He's one of my favorite people to read. One of my best friends is a PhD in history, and he hates Winston Churchill, and he refuses to talk about him, essentially because Winston Churchill was an unrepentant imperialist. He believed in the British Empire, and he did his best to keep the British Empire together. And I totally, and so he was, everybody, all of you know Gandhi, the famous, independence leader of India. And Winston Churchill had no time for him. He was not interested in supporting or listening or dealing with Gandhi at all. He thought he was a troublemaker. And so I think he's a very good person to end the British discussion with, because he's very polarizing. He's basically the reason that we don't speak German right now. He kept the war going against Adolf Hitler almost single-handedly. Britain was the only country resisting the Nazis, and he organized the resistance to Hitler so effectively that several years later, the Russians and the Americans and the British together were on the way to defeating the Nazis and the Japanese. So we owe the man a huge debt of gratitude. He saved us from, nobody knows what it would have been like to have Adolf Hitler in control of all of Europe for another 10 years. Nobody knows what would have happened, but we can be confident that he saved us from some terrible future by refusing by standing his ground and refusing to give in where everybody else was pretty much ready to throw in the towel and say, we've already lost. So that's his best quality, maybe, is stubbornness, you might say. He's committed, he was energetic, he was intelligent, he was brave, he was insistent, he was a brilliant speaker. So he was an excellent wartime prime minister. He was persuasive. He had all the tools that he needed to beat Hitler. But the interesting thing is, even before the war ended, after Hitler was gone, he lost his job. The British people realized that they needed Winston Churchill. His approval rating was incredible, like above 80% during the war. And then as soon as the war was not even over yet, it looked like it was done, he lost. So he's a very interesting historical figure, and it just goes to show that sometimes you just need certain types of people to be leaders. And he is an archetype. He is he was like a bulldog, a British bulldog. He was like one of those angry dogs that if you put him in a corner, he would just fight to the death. Um, he inspired a lot of people to stand up and resist, and I think he's a good place to end this discussion of British people, because we've had all of these different British people we've discussed. Lots of them are kings and queens, but they have whenever there has been some sort of crisis, they've had this ability to put somebody in that leadership role who had the necessary qualities to continue Britain through the emergency and into the next phase of its existence. This is what evolution is all about. I don't know what's going to happen right now. Currently, Boris Johnson is the Prime Minister, and we haven't seen him manage anything quite effectively yet. I'm not a big fan, but that doesn't mean you can't be. You can follow the news as well as me. But there are crises in United Kingdom, just like America right now. So both countries are in these unstable situations. Brexit and coronavirus in United Kingdom, and racial injustice and the coronavirus in the United States. And how are they going to be managed? Well, these crisis points should cause some changes in their culture in order to, get through the emergency and get to the next level. If they can't, there is going to end up being a revolution. One of my friends told me that they voted for Trump 4 years ago, and it was an African-American woman. And I was just so speechless. I couldn't understand why. I just wanted to know, like, what could you possibly see in that individual being your president? You're American, I'm not. And she said, because he'll bring the revolution. Which is a scary thought, because you're actually voting for somebody to do a bad job so that the society will implode, and it'll cause, maybe violently, but it'll cause change. So that's all part of how we sort of try to tie things together at the end of the course. That's nothing on Donald Trump is on the test, okay? Winston Churchill is, though. And what Winston Churchill said is when he got the opportunity to be the prime minister, because Adolf Hitler was destroying the world, he welcomed it. Winston Churchill was excited. He has a very strange personality, I think. But he was ready. This is my chance to make history. I was born to do this. Give me the position. I'm going to take care of this guy. It takes a special person to do that. One of the things that he's famous for saying is, Winston Churchill said, never waste a good opportunity, right? Never let a good opportunity go to waste. I think that's exactly what he said. So crisis is opportunity, right? Things are going to become unstable, but out of those things, there are opportunities for you to improve. So that is it. That's the end of our lecture series for this semester. Thank you so much for, following through all of the things. No board, long lectures, short lectures, 2 parts, 1 part. Honestly, I know the freshmen have been concerned because you've never experienced a course like that, but I put the grade report up there, and I'll be honest, the better grades are in among the younger students. If you look at the grade report list by the student numbers, there's no disadvantage for being a freshman. So I think all of you should study hard, and this week I will publish 2 more video lectures for you, going over all the material that's essential. And please, do make your own notes on the study guide, and look at the quizzes, because they're good examples of the multiple choice. One more thing, the exam has been shortened because headquarters wants us to only do a 1-hour exam, and usually our exam takes more like an hour and a half. So I reduced the number of questions. So there's only 2 short answer questions at the end, and there's 40 multiple choice questions. So honestly, it's more like a midterm in terms of length. So That's more good news for you. Just relax, make sure you go over your material carefully, and I'll see you 2 more times later this week. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.